Topic 31, Reconstruction, 1863 to 1877. You should take notes during this podcast, pause it as necessary, and listen to it as many times as you need to, as you will need these notes to complete future graded assignments. I recommend that you take notes in the Cornell method of note-taking as presented in Podcast 3 of this course. By the end of this podcast, students will be able to define Reconstruction and contextualize this period within the scope of U.S. history, identify several achievements of the Reconstruction era, and explain when and why Reconstruction failed, and analyze some consequences of that failure for African Americans in the South during the century that followed the Civil War. The Civil War that tore the United States apart between 1861 and 1865 remains the most lethal conflict in American history. Approximately 750,000 people from both the North and the South died. After the North defeated the South in 1865, Americans struggled to piece the tattered nation back together again. This period, which actually started before the war's end in 1863, became known as Reconstruction as the nation sought to reconstruct itself. In some important ways, however, the U.S. could not return to its antebellum ways, so the term Reconstruction is perhaps misleading. The nation was not built up as a replica of its past self. Most significantly, slavery was finally abolished through a constitutional amendment. Nevertheless, the impact of 250 years of subjugating African Americans remained in the racist power structures that took new form and terrorized Black Americans in the Jim Crow South for decades. Once it became clear that the North would win the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln began to lay the groundwork for Reconstruction. Lincoln's vision, as articulated in his second inaugural address, was that Northerners would welcome Southerners back into the Union, quote, with malice toward none, charity for all, end quote. Lincoln favored relatively lenient criteria for Confederate states to rejoin their former adversaries. Within Congress, however, other members of Lincoln's party, the Republicans, favored much more harsh penalties for Confederate leaders and stringent requirements for the Southern states to re-enter the Union. After Lincoln's assassination 9 days following General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, these radical Republicans commandeered control of Reconstruction. To many in the South, it seemed that radical Republicans sought vengeance for 4 years of unthinkable carnage. To the Southerners, the most egregious of Republican actions during Reconstruction were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution that collectively have become known as the Reconstruction Amendments. President Lincoln actually initiated the movement to abolish slavery, which was eventually accomplished with the 13th Amendment in 1865. While Lincoln's 1863 Emancipation Proclamation freed Southern slaves as a military tactic, by 2 years later, Lincoln, capable of remarkable evolution of thought, had become convinced of the immorality of slavery. When Southern states applied for readmission to the Union, they had to accept the 13th Amendment's abolition of slavery. Nevertheless, paramilitary organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan, founded in 1866, just 1 year after the South's loss in the Civil War, quickly formed in the wake of the freeing of all slaves. When African Americans attempted to exercise rights like moving about freely, voting, or succeeding economically, these white supremacist groups harassed or intimidated them with violence. Therefore, after Lincoln's death, radical Republicans moved to pass the 14th and 15th Amendments. The former guaranteed all Americans, regardless of race or previous condition of servitude, the right to equal protection under the law. The latter afforded all black men the right to vote. Congress also wrote into these amendments its own right to enforce these provisions, which meant that the U.S. Army stayed in many places in the South until the 1870s to see that Southerners adhered to the Reconstruction amendments. In addition to these constitutional achievements, Congress also established the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865. Freedmen was the contemporary term for former slaves. Freedmen's Bureau employees established schools for African Americans who, under slavery, were prevented by law from learning to read and write. The Freedmen's Bureau was also charged with negotiating contracts on behalf of African Americans who, lacking any other skills, were often forced to return to work as agricultural wage laborers for their former masters. Despite nominal Freedmen's Bureau support, these sharecroppers were often exploited by the owners of the land which they rented. They were called sharecroppers because they paid the landowner through delivery of a portion of the crop at season's end. As a result, black and white sharecroppers alike suffered through decades of poverty in the Jim Crow South. If economic change never arrived to the South, political change did not stick either, thanks to a backroom deal and a lack of will on the part of the North. After the ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870, many Northerners, who had grown weary after a decade of war and Reconstruction, began to feel that they had quote-unquote done enough for the South and African Americans, 90% of whom lived in the South at the time. When an economic recession hit the country in 1873, Northern resolve to continue supporting the Reconstruction project faltered even further. The final nail in Reconstruction's coffin came during the election of 1876. Though Democrat Samuel Tilden received more popular and electoral votes than Republican Rutherford B. Hayes in the first count for the presidency, 20 electoral votes remained in question. These 20 electoral votes could have thrown the election either way. The decision of whom to give these 20 votes to was decided in Congress and resulted in the Compromise of 1877. Congressmen opted to allow Republican Hayes to ascend to the White House in return for the removal of all U.S. troops from the South. With the official retreat of the Army, Southern Democrats known as Redeemers regained local control of state legislatures, imposing white supremacy through Jim Crow laws that permitted legal segregation and condoned paramilitary groups such as the KKK. Despite the remarkable achievements of the era, especially the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, Reconstruction eventually failed to secure lasting safety and equality for former slaves. Like the original sin of slavery itself, the blame lies in the North as much as it did in the South. In addition to retreating from military imposition of the Reconstruction Amendment's ideals, during the next 75 years, the North relinquished its moral outrage and came to embrace white Southerners as brothers. When they did so, they fulfilled Lincoln's dream of malice toward none, charity for all, but they also abandoned his hopes and the hopes of African Americans themselves that all Americans could live in freedom and equality. Let's close this podcast by watching footage from the last episode of Ken Burns' lauded documentary, The Civil War. In it, we see the fondness with which veterans of North and South greeted each other 50 and 75 years after key Civil War battles. That warmth, shown only among the white veterans, by the way, despite the presence of black veterans in the footage, suggests how Americans from the North and the South were able to bond over a shared history of whiteness and a mutual abandonment of the dream of racial equality.
In 1913, the government held a 50th anniversary reunion at Gettysburg. It lasted 3 days. Thousands of survivors bivouacked on the old battlefield, swapping stories, looking up old comrades. The climax was to be a reenactment of Pickett's charge. As the rebel yell rang out and the old Confederates started forward again across the fields, a moan, a gigantic gasp of unbelief, rose from the Union men on Cemetery Ridge. It was then, one onlooker said, that the Yankees, unable to restrain themselves longer, burst from behind the stone wall and flung themselves upon their former enemies, not in mortal combat, but embracing them in brotherly love and affection.
William Faulkner said once that history is not was, it's is. And what we need to remember about the Civil War is that the Civil War is, in the present as well as in the past. The generation that fought the war, the generation that argued over the definition of the war, the generation that had to pay the price in blood, that had to pay the price in blasted hopes and a lost future, also established a standard that will not mean anything until we have finished the work.
We're camping tonight on the old campground. Give us a song to cheer our weary hearts.
Gettysburg's guns are still, and the dead sleep on. America's most famous battleground is a camp again, with a road dividing the blue and gray. There is no other dividing line now, as 2,500 veterans gather from north and south to mark the 75th anniversary of America's Armageddon.